Okay, we're going to jump right in here and talk about personality for Chapter 11. The root for the word personality comes from persona, which is an ancient word referring to a mask that actors would use to allow them to perform different roles in a play. And this is actually remarkably apt when you think about where your personality comes from. Your personality develops as a result, as an attempt to adjust to the demands of the world, right? Things happen in your world, and your personality develops as you find ways of coping with challenges and demands. It develops as certain things are reinforced, not infrequently by some success, by reward, and other things are shaped. Other aspects of your personality are shaped by being punished. So you're less likely to demonstrate certain aspects of who you are. And so this public face that you present, which is certainly part of personality, although arguably not the whole personality, begins to develop. So when we think in terms of trying to operationally define personality, what we're talking about are some people talk in terms of a set of of behaviors or actions, behavioral traits that are characteristic that are unique to a certain person. So ways of behaving that are unique to that individual and consistent across time and situation, which is a valid description of an aspect of personality, but certainly few people would want to make the argument that our personalities, well, certainly you would not, I would not make the argument that my personality is just how I behave. We think, at least for ourselves and probably for the people that we're close to, we think of people's personalities not just as action, not just as behavioral traits, but also in terms of the way that the person thinks, their characteristic emotional expression, and for ourselves, our characteristic emotional experience, our subjective thought processes, so on and so forth. We tend to think in terms of strangers' personalities, in terms of maybe casual acquaintances' personalities, mostly in terms of their behavior. We think of ourselves, certainly, and perhaps some of our closest confidants in terms not just of behavior, but also of cognition and emotion. I kind of already alluded to this a little bit, but when we talk about personality, there's some components that you have to make sure you're accounting for. One thing is that we're talking about the traits, the cognition, the emotion, and the behavior that are consistent across time and across situation. So we behave in a similar manner regardless of context, essentially. Now that you have to qualify that, because that is one of the fascinating things about personality, is that you do have some consistency, but the evidence is very strong in the field of personality psychology that context matters tremendously. It has a significant influence on the expression of personality. But keep in mind, that's an important caveat. It has a significant influence on the expression of personality. So if we change the situation that you're in, your personality might look very different because of those changes. Now, have you really changed in terms of your subjective sense of yourself? Perhaps not. Although I would say if we say if we put you in a very dangerous situation, certainly your overt, the personality that we see, that the others see, mostly we're talking about behaviors there, may change fairly significantly because of the danger of the situation. You may not internally experience it as being significantly different, but certainly you can accept that if you are kept in that dangerous situation for a very long time, that it's very reasonable to think that it might not be just your overt behavior that begins to change, but also your subjective sense of yourself, the way you think about the world, the things that comprise personality, the kind of your consistent thoughts, emotions, and behaviors. The other thing that we think about when we talk about the context in which we are thinking when we talk about personality is that it certainly is a powerful influence on behavior. And this is, again, going to that idea that personality is not just synonymous with behavior. We're making an assumption. We experience it in ourselves, and we're making some assumptions when we see it, when we see behavior in others, that it is being influenced not just by our biology and by environmental factors, learning, experience, that kind of thing, but also by inherent traits and tendencies that we think of as comprising personality. We're going to talk in terms of 5 different basic theories of personality. We're going to skim through them very, very quickly. If you go to graduate school, you may spend whole class periods, whole semester-long classes talking about, certainly about Freud's theories of personality and the 5-factor model, the Big Five, or the ocean model. Probably a little less likely that you'd spend that much time on Maslow, Eysenck, and Jung, although each of them are fairly formidable in and of themselves. Okay, I'm going to go very, very quickly through Freud. This is kind of my background. This is where my original training is Freudian. I'm going to do my best to keep it short and sweet. So Freud talks about personality primarily metaphorically. Keep in mind he was a physician, a neurologist, and he was operating on the presumption that what we see as personality is essentially just a function of the brain. But of course, he was doing his thinking in the late 1800s and early 1900s when we didn't have a whole wealth of resources to look directly at brain function, PET scans, CAT scans, MRIs, that kind of thing, functional MRIs. So he had to extrapolate from what he experienced in psychotherapy primarily with people whose brains weren't working correctly. They were experiencing some sort of dysfunction. So he was taking his experiences in psychotherapy and extrapolating and trying to figure out how the personality is structured. In other words, what are the brain functions that comprise what we think of as personality? And when he talked about these functions, these cognitive and emotional functions that we think of as personality, he talked metaphorically in terms of topography. In other words, kind of the lay of the land, the broad picture from afar, which he characterized as levels of consciousness or levels of awareness. And he designated 3 of them. The conscious, not the conscience, but the conscious level, the preconscious level, and the unconscious level. And then he also made a distinction in terms of what he characterized as the structure of the personality, kind of the building of the personality or the house. And he divided his structural model into 3 components that he called the id, which is a translation of the actual word that he used in German, which was the it. The ego, the actual original term that he used, was the German word for the I. And then the superego, the German phrase that he used for that was the above I, and this will make a little more sense as we get talking about it. So when we're talking about the topography, the general overview of the personality, we'll start with with consciousness, because for Freud, consciousness was probably the least interesting aspect of the personality for him, which is really interesting because it's profoundly changed today. Consciousness studies are kind of the cutting edge, one of the cutting edges of the field of psychology. And it's just absolutely fascinating stuff. I think we talked a little bit about it when we talked about variations in consciousness earlier in the semester. For Freud, though, Freud made the point that what consciousness is essentially just the point of awareness. In other words, it's whatever is actively attended to in your mind at this moment. That's what you are aware of. That seems almost definitional. That is what you are conscious. That is your conscious. I always suggest that a way of thinking about this is imagining that you're in a dark room and you have one of those flashlights that's got a very powerful, very, very narrow beam, almost like a laser beam, but a very, very narrow beam. You're in a pitch black room. Consciousness would be whatever falls within that little beam of light. So you're shining it around the room, and whatever that beam of light is focused on at that moment is what you are conscious of. And as you move that beam, now you're no longer conscious of the thing you just had it pointed on. Now you're conscious of the thing that it shifted to, right? And if you think about it, if you take a second and you step back from your subjective experience and you think about it, this is exactly what's going on with consciousness. Full consciousness is whatever you are directing your awareness to in this moment. Nothing else is conscious, right? So in the Freudian model, consciousness is a very, very, very small aspect of who you are. He also made the point that consciousness, he's talking about it as topography, right? As if it's like a map, right? That the conscious, the preconscious, and the unconscious, these levels of awareness. But really what he's talking about when he's talking about consciousness, preconsciousness, and unconsciousness is a certain kind of cognitive process. Consciousness is that cognitive process that is underway when we are aware of something. And he made the point that he described consciousness and its precursor, preconsciousness, which we'll talk about in just a second, as possessing certain characteristics. And he called these characteristics secondary process thinking or secondary process thought. And he basically made the point that secondary process thought is kind of how you hopefully are thinking right now. It's logical, rational, word-based, you're aware of time, and we're going to not talk much about the other quality of secondary process thought that he identified, which is that it's capable of negation. So it's capable of saying that something is not X or un-X, right? That becomes an issue if you get like into graduate school and you get talking about the implications of his personality theory in terms of dream formation and these kinds of things. But for our purposes, I just want you to be aware, secondary process thinking. So the thinking that is characteristic of awareness and consciousness, Freud designated as rational or logical, language-based, and sequenced, aware of time, aware of sequencing, this sort of thing. And again, that's the way that's kind of human level thinking. And he's going to juxtapose that with a deeper animal level of thinking that characterizes what he called the unconscious processes. And that deeper animal level of thinking is called primary process. So we're going to come to that in just a second. But going back to consciousness, he made the designation that everything that is easily available to awareness or consciousness, awareness and consciousness are almost synonymous. He said that everything that you're not currently aware of, but it's easy for you to pull it into awareness, is preconsciousness. So using that light bulb, the flashlight metaphor that I was talking about before, where you're focusing a beam and you're moving it around a pitch black room, and whatever the beam falls upon is what you were aware of or what you're conscious of. Pre-consciousness would be everything that the beam was just touching, or in the immediate perimeter of the beam, and everything the beam is going to touch here in just a second, right? So pre-consciousness is just the stuff that's easily accessible to consciousness. That would be things like, I don't know, what did you have for breakfast? Without looking, what do you have on your feet? What kind of socks or shoes or slippers or whatever do you have on your feet? Things that you might not be thinking of in the moment, but they're very easy to pull into awareness, all right? So consciousness is whatever you are aware of in the moment. Pre-consciousness is all of the stuff about you, about your environment, about your sensory input, all that kind of stuff that you can easily become aware of or have just been aware of. So that's really all we're going to say about awareness and consciousness, the conscious and the pre-conscious, potential awareness or easily available awareness. Now we're going to shift and talk about unconsciousness, and this is the probably the most valuable contribution that Freud made, is emphasizing how big of a deal and how large a component or how important a component of our personalities is everything that's going on below the level of awareness. And that's all he really means by the unconscious. The unconscious is just all the stuff that's not easily available to awareness. And if you think about it, the unconscious then is almost everything that you are. So the unconscious in this moment is everything that is not immediately adjacent to your awareness. Now, a lot of the stuff in the unconscious, a lot of who you are that you're not aware of in the moment, you can pull up into awareness. It might not necessarily be very easy for you to do. It might take some effort. In fact, it might be pulling some things about who you are up into awareness, Freud argued, is something that you really would probably rather not do, because he argued that we're all kind of composed of urges and drives that are significantly problematic because they make getting along with other people and functioning as a part of society very, very difficult. And basically what he's talking about is our animal urges. The urges that are characteristic of us as biological animals, but are inconsistent with our image of ourselves as human beings, and are inconsistent with our role as part of a civilized society. And so they're punished, they're discouraged, and he argued that they're driven into the unconscious because they are threatening to us, in the sense that they're threatening to our image of ourselves and to the role that we play. So all that being said, that is certainly very important when we're talking about the unconscious. The unconscious fundamentally is just everything that lies outside of the conscious and the pre-conscious, the stuff that's in your awareness and easily available to your awareness. He argued that this is essentially running the show, and I think that's quite obviously the case. Again, if you take a step back and you think about it, most of what you do throughout the day, you do without ever being aware that you intended to do it, right? We're going to shift something right now from your unconscious into your pre-conscious and then almost instantaneously into your conscious. But unless I were to say this to you, you would never pull it up into consciousness. Think about how you're sitting right now in your chair, right? So prior to me saying, think about how you're sitting right now in your chair, how your posture and everything, unless you were uncomfortable, your posture, how you were sitting, how you were holding your body, how you were oriented, these kind of things, was in your unconscious. It was intentional. You chose it. It wasn't an accident. You had to flex certain muscles and hold certain muscles in tone to maintain a certain posture. You shift, but you're doing all of this movement and all of this maintenance of posture without oftentimes without ever being aware that you're doing it, right? All that is taking place in the unconscious, and unless somebody like I just did points out to you, think about your posture, think about how you're sitting, you might go for hours without ever giving any thought to it. It remains in the unconscious, but it's running the show in the sense that it is, I don't want to say controlling because it sounds like that's part of you that isn't you, but you are, most of what you do, you are doing without consciously choosing to do it, or consciously choosing not to do something else, right? So he was arguing that the unconscious is really running most of who you are. I'll give you a different example just real quick. As I'm saying all this stuff to you right now, as words are coming out of my mouth, I'm aware of them, right? But obviously, prior to the words coming out of my mouth, somewhere deep down in my head, they're being formulated. The sentences and the paragraphs are being kind of put together, and hopefully they make some degree of sense. And all of that is taking place, when I say deep down in my head, all of that is taking place below the level of awareness. I'm not thinking before I say a sentence, I'm not consciously thinking of that sentence. It just seems to spring up out of, in this case, the unconscious, into awareness as I'm saying it, right? So again, even the way we talk, the words that we form, the thoughts that we form, Freud pointed out, are clearly being processed below the level of awareness, processed in the unconscious. And he argued that we do probably most of our thinking, and there's some good evidence to support this now, most of our thinking happens below the level of awareness. Now, one of the things that he pointed out about the unconscious, especially things that are deeply unconscious, and we're going to talk about that here in just a minute, but he basically said, when you are aware of something, when your brain is functioning, the kind of the cognitive processes that we think of as consciousness and pre-consciousness, so things that are easily available to awareness, function according to that secondary process. They function according to secondary process: logical, rational, time-based, language-based, right? But he said, as you move down away from consciousness into deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper and more primal levels of brain functioning, more and more and more unconscious, he argued that the processing that is going on at that level is not necessarily logical, is not verbal. It's more image-based, picture-based, not just picture-based though, sound-based. It basically disconnected from language. And that it's possessed of no negation, no sense of time, no temporal order, no sequencing. Think about it like this. It's very much how one would presume an animal thinks, right? Animals aren't thinking in words. Even fairly sophisticated mammals, dogs and cats and such, don't have language. They don't use words. They recognize certain sounds and they can pair certain sounds with certain actions. But that's not the same thing as symbolic use of language, right? And other mammals don't use, there may be an exception there, like with dolphins perhaps, but other animals don't use symbolic language. And what Freud is arguing is that at some level of processing in our brain, this is how we function too. The deep down functioning in our brain is not language based, and it's not logical, and it couldn't be logical because logic is language based, right? Logic is based on symbolism and based on mathematics, and which is a form of language, right? And he also makes the point that it's not that it becomes less and less and less and less aware of time. There are some reasons for that. Again, they go back to things like dream formation and such, and we're not going to spend a lot of time talking. We're not going to spend any time talking about that because we don't have time. But I want you just to basically recognize that there is essentially, according to Freud, a secondary process, which you can think of kind of as human level thinking, and primary process that also goes on deep down in the brain, and that it's a very primitive kind of animalistic way that your brain works also. And these aren't two separate processes, they're gradations of a process, right? And so he would say, you may be processing things deep down in the brain in this very primal primary process way. But as you try to pull those things into awareness, they get changed the way they're coded, the way the way you are coding your thinking, the way the nature of the cognition changes and becomes secondary process. It becomes expressed through language. It becomes what would the word be? It becomes subject to the rules of logic. It becomes kind of tied to an experience of time and sequencing and this sort of thing. So it becomes much more sophisticated, like in the sense of being the way human beings think. So I'm going to shift from topography, the levels of awareness, consciousness, pre-consciousness, and unconsciousness. And now we're going to talk about the structure that overlays those levels of consciousness. And we'll start, since we just finished talking about unconsciousness, we'll talk about the structure of the personality that Freud proposed was deeply unconscious, and he called that the it. And this is essentially your animal self. This is the animal core, he would argue, at the center of every human being. It's the source of your urges and your instincts and your drives. So hunger, thirst, the urge to reproduce, to sleep, all these kinds of things. And he basically makes the argument that when he describes the id, he says that it knows no judgments of value, no good and evil, no morality, and he called it the dark, inaccessible part of our personality. And basically what he was getting at was that and if you think about this corresponds very well with how we understand the brain, right? As you move away from the cortex and down deeper into the brain, and you move like into the limbic system, kind of the emotional brain, so to speak, and then you move down past the midbrain into the hindbrain, and you're talking about in the hindbrain these basic life functions, right? Well, that hindbrain, and then moving up into the thalamus and hypothalamus and the limbic system and all that kind of stuff that kind of sits above that. That, in a very real way, that's kind of what he was talking about when he was describing the id. He was saying, it's the place, it's the aspect of who we are from which all of our urges and desires and drives comes from. He also argued that this is where your energy comes from, the energy to go do anything. And that's why he called it a chaos, a cauldron full of seething excitation. And basically, if you think about it, that is exactly what that deep down part of your brain is, your brain stem essentially. And your limbic system are the aspect of your brain from which all of your urges arise. From the energy to go do anything comes from that part of your brain. The structures in the brain that are responsible for mediating the experience of hunger are the part of your personality from which the urge arises to drive you to act, to go find something to eat, right? So that's what he's talking about when he's talking about the id, is that deep down animal instinct. And he said that the id is inherently and permanently unconscious. And basically that's because it's functioning according to primary process. The way that part of your brain thinks, he called primary process. And think about it like this. Try to be conscious of something, try to be aware of something without using language, without having any awareness of time, without using logic, and without using negation. So basically by doing that, we're taking away all of the trappings of awareness. So what he was saying is, the way this part of the brain processes information, this part of the personality, which is in his way of thinking the brain, the way it processes information, it isn't available to awareness. He also made the point that this part of the personality is preoccupied only with getting needs met. I don't want to be hungry. I don't want to be thirsty. I don't, or perhaps maybe a little closer to how he talked about it is, I want to be satiated in all aspects, right? He called this the pleasure principle, and that is basically that the id is focused on reduction of tension associated with frustration of drives. So I just want what I want when I want it, which is kind of, if you think about it, this is how you are when you're born, right? This is how babies function. I just want what I want when I want it, and there's no reference to anything in reality whatsoever. A baby is essentially a little id, right? It's entirely just focused on whether it's experiencing pleasure, which is good, or unpleasure or pain, which is bad, right? And if it's hungry or thirsty or wet or tired or whatever, it's gonna flail about and protest, but especially early on, immediately shortly after birth, without reference to the world around it, because it doesn't understand any of that yet. It's all id. It's just protesting the unpleasure, protesting the discomfort of hunger or coldness or thirst or whatever, right? So he made the point that this animal aspect of who we are, and certainly essentially almost everything that we start out as in infancy, functions according to the pleasure principle and is characterized by what we were talking about earlier with the primary process thinking. What he pointed out is that while we are born essentially all id, we're little animals at birth, little instinctual pleasure-seeking creatures at birth. What happens very quickly is that the infant, the person, is pressed out of necessity into learning about his or her environment and learning to respond or not respond in certain ways in order to get your needs met, right? So you learn, at first you do this by instinct, that you're in some discomfort, you're hungry, and so by instinct you start to cry. And when you cry, if you have good parents, they come and they try to figure out why you're crying and address it. And in this case, they oh, you must be hungry, and they give you a bottle and you stop crying. And over time, you experience this pattern again and again and again, that you cry, you make this noise as you learn kind of where you end and the world begins, right? And you learn that you make these sounds with your mouth, and by making these sounds with your mouth, your hunger is satiated, although you don't have the language to explain that to yourself. You just have the experience of it. Gradually what happens is, through consistency of experience, you learn that, yeah, your hunger is satiated, and it tends to be when this particular person, which of course you don't recognize as a person initially, you have to learn that, comes in the room and gives you a bottle or breastfeeds you or whatever, right? And so you have to gradually learn all of this about your world. You literally learn the limits of you, right? You learn where you end and the rest of the world begins, and you learn what mommy is and daddy is and bottle and food and eventually cracker and your pet's name and all, and juice, all these things. You pick these things up, but you pick these things up through trial and error. As you develop cognitively, and we talked about cognitive development, Piaget, and this sort of thing, as you go through this process of becoming a little more sophisticated daily, weekly, and monthly, Freud argued that you begin to shift from that pleasure principle, I want what I want when I want it, to what he called the reality principle, which is you begin to recognize that I may want what I want when I want it, but if I just act that way, I'm not taking the optimal path to getting my needs met, right? If I just take whatever I want when I want it, or I demand things, or if I just flail about when I'm unhappy, and I'm not taking the best route to getting my needs met. If I'm hungry, you get to be 6 months old, and your bottle is sitting right there, and you've got the motor skills now to pick the bottle up and put it in your mouth. If I'm still functioning according to the pleasure principle, which is just protesting, I just want what I want when I want it, and I don't have to do anything, I just want it, then the bottle's sitting right there and you just scream and yell. But of course, what happens in the first 6 months of life is you connect that image of that bottle with the experience of being fed. And you gain motor control over your hands, and you can reach out and you can grab that bottle and put it in your mouth and feed yourself, right? And this is what we're describing there is as you master this cognition, these cognitive processes, you begin to establish what he called the I, or the ego. And this is really kind of your sense of self. And it functions according to, like I said, what he called the reality principle, which is you taking an active hand in trying to reduce, essentially you're making compromises, you're making concessions so that you can maximize the amount of pleasure that you get in existence, and you can minimize the amount of suffering. And basically, so essentially what the ego is it's the part of the personality that grows, and it becomes the preponderance, hypothetically, of kind of how we experience ourselves. We experience ourselves predominantly as our ego. And the ego is essentially the seat of consciousness. It's the part of the personality that grows up as you begin to acquire language, which Freud understood as the basis for consciousness, as you begin to acquire the capacity or the early building blocks, I guess, of logic and a capacity for abstract thinking, those kinds of things. That is the ego developing essentially kind of around the id, metaphorically. And he pointed out that the ego is essentially the aspect of the brain functions that all kind of coalesce together around the task of getting your needs met, right? So balancing between the demands of the animal aspect of who you are, I just want what I want when I want it, with the demands of the world around you, right? You have to make some concessions. You can't just take what you want. You have to make some concessions to the demands of your caregivers, just to practical demands, right? If you're laying on your back and you become uncomfortable laying on your back, yelling and screaming about it doesn't do a whole lot to change that. Activating certain muscles and turning over so that you're not uncomfortable anymore changes the circumstances, right? So this is the shift from pleasure principle to reality principle. It's the development of the ego as language is acquired, and the capacity to think in language and to think in symbols and to begin to use the rudimentary building blocks of logic to balance between the demands of this animal self and the demands of the environment. That is the ego, functioning according to what he called the reality principle. And then he made the point that a little later on, usually around 3, 4, 5 years old, 6 maybe, you get the gradual development of what he called the over-I, or the super ego. And essentially this is the component of the personality that develops as you internalize the expectations, usually of your primary caregivers. The rules about what's right and wrong, what's desirable and undesirable in terms of your behavior. And he actually subdivided the superego. He said it's actually composed of the conscience, which is the judgment of right and wrong, and the ego ideal, which is kind of what you aspire to be. And you base this on what you have modeled for you by your parents. And he made the point that the superego develops basically almost like it's like sitting over your shoulder. It's the angel on this shoulder, and the id is the devil on this shoulder. And the devil says, just take it. And the superego is like, no, you're gonna get punished for that. And it's trying to help the ego implement the reality principle, balance between the urges and the demands of the id and the anticipated consequences of implementing those demands. The environmental, the world consequences of just taking what you want when you want it, right? So, levels of awareness: preconscious, conscious, unconscious, or starting from the bottom, unconscious, conscious, excuse me, unconscious, preconscious consciousness. And then in terms of the structure of the personality, deep down, entirely and permanently unconscious, the id, the component of the personality that's responsible for balancing between the demands of the id, the animal demands of yourself, and the demands of the world is the ego, the part of you that thinks in words and language and is logical and rational and so on and so forth. And then kind of adjacent to all this, the superego, the part of the personality that is kind of the seat of your conscience, essentially. And I have a slide in here to kind of visually represent this for you. For those of you who think in pictures, there you go, good picture, good kind of summary of his model of Freud's model of thinking about how the personality is laid out. Okay, the last thing we're going to cover regarding Freud's theory of personality, which, by the way, if we were going to cover in any sort of detail, would easily take a full semester of a 3-credit class to do justice to. But the last thing we're going to cover briefly is his idea of defense mechanisms. And defense mechanisms are basically the cognitive strategies that we use to manage impulses that could get us in trouble with others, impulses that violate our sense of selves, urges that we see as profoundly and animal urges. Keep in mind, what we're talking about here, in part, defense mechanisms are strategies that the ego uses to contain impulses, the animal impulses arising from the id, the animal self, right? The animal aspect of the person. So perhaps the best way to explain this is to give you some examples. I have 8 examples of defense mechanisms here listed for you. There are many, 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 many. We're not going to even begin to try to cover all of them, even if we had the time. But I'll start as an example. The repression, the most fundamental of the defense mechanisms, and kind of the mechanism which forms the foundation of all of the others. And repression is just, in Freud's definition, unconscious, intentional forgetting. So basically, you have some impulse or some idea that, for whatever reason, is intolerable or is dangerous, and your brain essentially says, I'm not going to focus on this. I'm not going to deal with this, and it intentionally suppresses it, represses it is actually the technical term. It intentionally pushes it down into the unconscious. It intentionally takes something that threatens to become something that you are in danger of becoming aware of, that if you became aware of it, it would be significantly problematic. And the unconscious part of your ego, the unconscious part of the of your personality that is responsible for managing impulses, for protecting you from yourself and from threats in the environment, that part of the ego essentially says, we're not dealing with this. If this sounds a little odd and foreign to you, it isn't. It's actually a universal sort of experience. All of you have experienced this at one time or another. And the most common and classic example of this is the repression that we experience on awakening from a dream. You've probably had this experience before. You wake up from a dream and you think, oh man, I gotta, some extraordinarily intense, vivid, sometimes pleasant, sometimes unpleasant dream. You've all had the experience, almost certainly, of awakening from that dream and thinking, oh, I need to tell so-and-so. And 20 minutes later, you get dressed, you get up and get dressed, and you're thinking, oh, I got to tell my mom or my dad or my sibling or somebody about this dream, my friend. And the 20 minutes it takes you to get dressed and get your teeth brushed and everything, and kind of go down to breakfast or go out into the hallway to see you walk up to your mom or your friend or whomever, and you say, oh man, I had this dream and you realize that in the 20 minutes in between awakening from the dream and trying to tell somebody about it, it's gone. You can't remember it, or certainly the details of it are gone. Now, bear in mind, this is a nearly universal, if not universal, experience. This happens to people who have no problem with their memory. They're not demented. They don't have brain damage. This is something that they want to remember, that is emotionally intense, and within minutes, it's gone. Freud called this process, in fact, he discovered it by paying close attention to dreams. He called this process repression. We are repressing something. We're intentionally pushing down into the unconscious something that could cause trouble for us. And basically the idea, in terms of dreams, Freud hypothesized that dreams are, at least in part, the urges and desires and such that we have hidden from ourselves because they are dangerous. And he hypothesized that when you go to sleep and most of the ego kind of goes offline, so to speak, that these urges can re-emerge from the unconscious, and that the dream essentially is the ego's, the brain's, the ego's attempt to protect you from these urges, and it does so by disguising them, hiding them from you in the stories that comprise your dreams. So, right or wrong about the nature of dreams, although there's a lot to be said for his theory of dreams, right or wrong about the nature of dreams, they form the basis for him developing this theory of defense mechanisms, repression being the most fundamental of them. I'll give you some other examples on the list here. Projection. Projection is essentially mistaking as coming from outside the person what is actually coming from within the person. And projection is essentially the source of all, or not all, much of prejudice and hatred. The analytic, psychoanalytic theory, the Freudian theory for things like racism and homophobia and these kinds of prejudices is that you have somebody who has, in the example of homophobia, is probably the easiest example to give you. The psychoanalytic theory of homophobia is that it is quite literally phobia, that is quite literally fear, and that basically it is the result of somebody who has sexual urges that they're struggling with or that they're afraid of, and that they're so fearful of this that what they essentially do is they repress them. They do not allow themselves to be aware that they have these impulses. And as a way of managing the impulse, they concoct, I guess, they tell themselves the story that it isn't me that is the danger here, it's somebody else. So in the case of homosexual impulses, the person who fears that potential in them sees it in somebody else and hates it. So in other words, or somebody who is a racist sees that which they fear most in themselves, ignorance, dirtiness, violence, whatever. And they convince themselves that, no, it's not me. It's this person who looks dramatically unlike me. I'm not somebody who has trouble containing my sexual impulses. I'm not somebody who has trouble containing my violent urges, whatever. I'm not an ignorant person. It's this person who is so very, very much unlike me. Projection is also the basis for paranoia. The paranoid person who thinks everybody's out to get them inevitably is somebody who has very strong aggressive urges and feels hostility toward others. They manage it by kind of telling themselves, it's not me, it's them. I'm not the aggressive one, it's this person who's out to get me. So projection is essentially mistaking what is coming from within as instead coming from outside the person. Displacement. Displacement is the management of an impulse by redirection, essentially. You can think about displacement in these terms. A dad is at work and he gets yelled at by his boss, who's just a real jerk to him, just really hostile and really unfair, and he chews the guy out, and the guy, of course, is humiliated and frustrated and angry about it. But of course, if he goes back at the boss, he could get fired. So he kind of suppresses, and in psychoanalytic theory, suppression is essentially the cousin, so to speak, or the sibling of repression. Repression is intentional, unconscious intentional forgetting, right? So you're hiding something from yourself and you don't even know you're doing it. Suppression is, I know this thing is here and I'm not going to allow myself to think about it. Suppression is another of the defense mechanisms. So the guy gets yelled at by his boss. He has the urge to be aggressive back toward the boss, but he knows it could cost him his job, so he suppresses that urge, squashes it down, kind of simmers all day at work, goes home, he's in a bad mood because this stuff is still there inside of him, so to speak. And he gets home and he opens the front door, and he has little kids, and his little kids come running to him, and oh, daddy, daddy, daddy. And he is just he's had it up to here, and he snaps at the kids and yells at them, and gets them crying, and they run away in tears because daddy was mean to them. And so what the guy did in that case was displace the anger that he had toward this powerful figure in his life, his boss, onto figures in his life, his kids, who don't have the power, and so are safe objects for that hostility and that aggression. So he displaced that hostility onto a safer target. That is what displacement is. Kind of similar to displacement, another example of a defense mechanism is reaction formation. And reaction formation essentially, it's kind of the foundation, I would say, for many romantic comedies. I mean, how many romantic comedies have as their basis two main characters, a guy and a girl, who have each been hurt in their own way in prior relationships, and they have some sort of meet cute and instantly can't stand each other, right? They have this very hostile reaction toward each other. Of course, in romantic comedies, they're almost inevitably both very attractive people. It's very apparent to the viewer that both of them are instantly attracted to one another, and yet they have this hostility. And of course, the hostility is what? The hostility is their attempt to protect themselves from being hurt yet again, right? So, and the Freudian term for that is reaction formation. Reaction formation is that I have an urge or a feeling, but that urge or feeling is so threatening to me, is threatening to me. So what I do is I repress that urge and I allow only the expression of its opposite. So I have this strong attraction. I'm in that romantic comedy, and I meet this woman, and I've been hurt, and I find myself attracted to her, but that so scares me that I distance myself. I manage that attraction by pushing her away, by being hostile to her, trying to pretend to myself like I don't have this urge, by being hostile to her. Reaction formation. Regression. Regression is a very simple and very commonly experienced. You've probably had this experience yourself, where you're in a situation where developmentally you're being challenged by something that's perhaps overwhelming or frightening for you, and you handle that overwhelming or frightening thing by retreating to a safer period in development. So this might be something as common as, it's not unusual, you may be shocked by the number of people who bring stuffed animals from their childhood to college with them, and find themselves at some point in the semester holding on to that stuffed animal. That would be what Freud would call a regression. That you're challenged by these new things developmentally, and you kind of find respite and comfort temporarily, hopefully temporarily, by regressing to an earlier developmental period. It also might be, the adult who comes home from a hard day of work and plays video games, right? Nothing, and bear in mind, we call these defense mechanisms. The implication sometimes when you hear the word defense, it would be defensive. We tend to think of that in a negative light, but in fact, it is not a negative thing. these can be negative. Projection as a good example. Projection is often negative, but it is not inevitably a bad thing. Regression, as an example, isn't inevitably a bad thing. There's nothing wrong with temporarily kind of retreating to some earlier period in development that's comforting for you. Now, if that was permanent, if that regression was permanent, that would be profoundly problematic. But so defense mechanisms can be problematic, but they aren't inevitably so. We're going to move on to the last three here just real quick. Rationalization is very straightforward. It's used very, very frequently, especially by smarter people. It's rampant in college populations because college populations tend to be smarter than the general population. Rationalization is just explaining away. You have a misbehavior or a problematic urge, and you quell the guilt or the regret or the fear that's associated by that by explaining away the urge, by rationalizing the urge. A particular type of rationalization might be that you have a friend and he was rude to you and you punched him in the nose because he was rude to you. And you go away from that situation, you get the chance to calm down after that, and you had the thought that, oh man, I feel so bad, I shouldn't have punched him. Yeah, he was rude, but that was over. And you're wrestling with this guilt, and to manage the guilt, you rationalize your behavior. Well, you know what? No, he deserved what I did. In fact, I was actually even doing him a favor, because if somebody else, maybe they would really have hurt him. If he continues being rude to people in this way, he's not going to just get punched in the nose. Something worse is going to happen at some point. And so, in fact, me losing my temper and punching him in the nose may have actually been a good thing for him. And certainly it was understandable, because anybody would, that's rationalization, right? You're explaining it away. Identification. Identification is not only a defense mechanism, but it's also part and parcel of normal human development. Identification is a way of handling circumstances in which you feel inadequate. The classic example of this would be the little boy who falls in love with reading comic books and watching movies about superheroes. And of course, the reason why, and drawing pictures of superheroes and having superhero outfits and this sort of thing. And of course, why does he find superheroes so compelling? The reason he finds superheroes so compelling is that they are the very thing that he is so missing in himself. The little boy who is old enough that he's aware of his masculinity, but still young enough that his masculinity is not adult, right? So this is a prepubescent or recently pubescent kid who feels very, very acutely his own inadequacy relative to his masculinity and power, strength, capability, these kinds of things. And so he finds people to admire and identify with and try to be like who encapsulate those ideals, right? They are incredibly powerful, incredibly capable, incredibly brave, these kinds of things. So that's identification. And we do that with things like superheroes and Disney princesses and that kind of thing. But we also do it just in the course of normal development with our parents. And this forms the basis of what we were talking about when we talked about human development in the Oedipal stage. That it's the old, if you can't beat them, join them. That I can't compete with my dad for my mom's affection, so perhaps I will become more like my dad. Or I can't compete with my mom for my daddy's affection, so I will become more like my mom. That's identification. And then the last example of a defense mechanism that I'll give you just real quickly here is what Freud called sublimation. And sublimation is somewhat anomalous. It's the exception to the rule in this list. It's the one defense mechanism that is virtually never a negative. It's virtually never problematic. You can see how all the rest of these, at some point or another, probably could be problematic. Sublimation, I guess hypothetically, could be in some way, but it is generally not, simply by definition. Sublimation is when you take an urge or a desire that could cause trouble for you, and you find some socially or personally acceptable way of expressing that urge. And the classic example of sublimation is the surgeon, right? Surgeons by personality tend to be very aggressive, achievement-focused people, and psychoanalytic thinkers point out that the surgeon is the person who has taken a strong, aggressive urge and turned it into something that is not only socially acceptable, but actually can make you a very good living and comes with all sorts of authority and respect and so on and so forth. And if you kind of find yourself recoiling a little bit from that, take a second and think about what exactly surgery is. Surgery is inherently very aggressive. You're taking a knife to somebody. You're rendering them unconscious and you're cutting them open. That is inherently aggressive. It's inherently controlling. And it takes a tremendous amount of confidence, obviously, for a person to even to consider doing something like that. So sublimation, so that idea is that they have this aggressive urge. They have perhaps a need to control others, although not inevitably the case. And one of the ways in their lives that they get this need met is they sublimate it into, they express it through a behavior that's actually very socially acceptable. So, again, real quick examples of these generally unconscious, with the exception of suppression, the generally unconscious strategies that we use to manage problematic impulses, to manage the problems that arise from our animal selves. And that's really the last thing I'm going to say about Freud. There's much, much more we could talk about. I would love to talk about, because I think Freud's an interesting, and his theory is an interesting theory to talk about, but we just simply do not have the time. I'm going to transition over. We're going to talk real briefly about a couple of things, and then we're going to talk at some length about five-factor theory. So now I want to talk to you briefly about Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Maslow's developmental theory essentially was a response to Freud. Freud was a determinist. His theory of personality was, as a result of being a determinist causal, fairly skeptical about human nature. And it was, of course, based on his work with people who were having fairly significant psychological and neurological problems. And Maslow very reasonably observed that something fairly close, that it's a pretty famous quote, and it's something fairly close to Freud gave us a picture of the unhealthy personality. Now we need to kind of lay out the healthy personality. In other words, Freud talked about things that could go wrong with the personality and did a pretty good job of explaining them. He didn't do a lot of talking about what does it look like when a personality proceeds in a healthy manner. Maslow didn't necessarily dispute the things that Freud was laying out in terms of the personality, the basic personality theory, but he wanted to talk about kind of the implications of healthy development. And he primarily framed this in terms of the opposite of Freud's causal approach. He thought about this in terms of motivation, a teleological approach. What's pulling somebody forward? What aspiration? What role does aspiration play in development? And he hypothesized that human beings have, to some degree, an instinct for what he called actualization, or fulfillment of one's potential. And he made the observation that this aspiration to fulfill one's potential, to improve oneself, begins to be expressed more and more fully as certain more fundamental needs are satisfied. And you can see here in the pyramid depiction of it, which, by the way, this is how you always see Maslow's hierarchy of needs depicted. And a little trivia tidbit, Maslow never drew a pyramid. He never depicted his theory in this way. It's just basically become universal at this point. When we talk about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, we talk about it in terms of this pyramid. With at the base, basic physiological needs, for something as basic as breathing, food, water, the basic physiological needs. If those are met, he argued, the person's attention then becomes focused on security, essentially. General, broad kind of culture or societal safety, morality, promotion of health, protection of family, these kinds of things. And to the degree that one's need for safety is better and better and better addressed, he argued that people's attention and their hunger, so to speak, shifts to a need for belonging and connectedness. So this isn't just family connections, which probably would fit at least partially under the kind of the rubric of safety, but also friendships, dating relationships, identification with groups. In the modern world, it would include things like identification to the group by means of labels, wearing team jerseys, wearing college jerseys, wearing certain brands, these kinds of things to identify yourself as distinct from some and affiliated with others. So love, belonging, connectedness. And then as those needs are generally satisfied, and bear in mind, as we're talking about these different levels, the physiological needs, the safety needs, the love and belongingness needs, and the esteem needs, he is not arguing, in fact, would observe that these needs can never be fulfilled completely. At least in the sense of the one level of need that can be fulfilled completely, physiological. You can be briefly satiated in terms of your need for air, your need for food, water, sexual urges, sleep. In other words, you can completely fulfill that where you don't need any more for the moment. But of course, those needs always reemerge in time. Beyond the basic physiological needs, he made the observation, the accurate observation, that your needs for safety, connectedness, and esteem can never be fully met. You can never be satiated. You can never be completely safe. You can never be completely accepted and connected. You can never have full and unquestioned or complete esteem. So he recognized that these don't have to be, in fact can't be, completely fulfilled before the next stage or the next level of the hierarchy begins to be desired. So if you have a basic physiological, if your basic physiological needs are met, if you're fundamentally reasonably safe, if you have some degree of connectedness, you'll find yourself aspiring more and more to esteem, to self-esteem, to want to be okay with yourself, to feel okay about yourself, to have some sense of self-respect, to want to appear respectable or admirable in the eyes of others, etc., etc. And then you can see how related to that is what he hypothesized is a deeper urge that frankly, for the majority of people, is never realized. He hypothesized that less than 1% of the population actually becomes actualized. And self-actualization, the peak of his hypothetical pyramid of needs, was basically this hypothetical level at which the person essentially fulfills his or her potential. And again, he proposed the vast majority of people never reach this level. And in fact, most don't even consistently aspire to this for a variety of reasons that are fairly complex and that he lays out in his books. But he was essentially kind of giving some attention to the reality that we all know, that there are some people that seem somehow more complete, wiser, more capable, more loving, more admirable isn't really the right word, that they just seem more fully actualized, they're more fully expressed, more closer to their actual potential. And hypothetically, presumably, they have been driven to this. They have a strong need for this. And Maslow talked about the variables underlying the evident reality that some people appear really to want to become the best version of themselves. Other people might talk about it, but they never really pursue it. Some people appear to hunger not just to become the best version of themselves, but also to make their world orderly and peaceful and beautiful. So I'm not going to say much more about this. I want you to be aware of this concept of self-actualization, and the proposed idea that it is actually a fairly unique thing, fairly rare thing. Again, like less than 1% of the population, he hypothesized, actually reaches the level of self-actualization. But he hypothesizes that to some degree it is an underlying need that propels general aspiration to constantly seek, and most people you see some expression of this need to improve in little ways, need to accomplish something better, etc., etc. We're going to move on from Maslow, and just very, very briefly, we're going to talk about a couple of different things here that are related to one another in a variety of ways. We're going to start out by talking kind of in reverse chronological order. We're going to talk about a guy named Hans Eysenck. Hans Eysenck was a colossal pain in the ass to everybody who knew him, basically, and I say that with admiration. He was an empiricist. He was a German-born psychologist that lived in England, and he really pushed the idea of making psychology a science, of pushing it more and more and more in the direction of hard science. And he was an avowed empiricist. He believed in science as a way of knowing the world, a way of knowing things confidently, and he held everything to that measure. So he got himself in trouble actually on a number of occasions by investigating things scientifically, coming up with answers that were politically or popularly incorrect, and then defending those conclusions staunchly. And not least of these things was he was incredibly hostile to Freud's theories of personality and mental illness and that sort of thing. Essentially, he was a physiologist. He argued that personality, and in fact much of the human condition, is determined largely by our genetic inclinations. He thought very heavily in terms of personality as an expression of biology. And the reality is there's a lot of evidence now to support some of his ideas. Not that they necessarily exclude some of the things that Freud was thinking about, especially if you think about Freud more in terms of his theories being metaphors for brain functions. But Isaac definitely was onto something by pushing the field to think more in terms of physiology and genetics. He talked about personality actually in terms of three concepts or traits, but we're gonna omit the third and talk just about the two primary ones that have kind of stood the test of time. He proposed traits of extroversion and neuroticism, and he proposed these extroversion. He defined as the act, state, or habit of being predominantly concerned with obtaining gratification from what is outside the self. So being externally focused and having your energy kind of directed outward. If you're familiar with the concepts of extroversion and introversion, the popular concept of extroversion was established largely by Isaac. And he argued that both extroversion and what he called neuroticism, and that we still use this term today popularly, both extroversion and neuroticism. But so he identified extroversion and he identified neuroticism, neuroticism being basically emotional instability. So a propensity toward negative emotion, anxiety, fear, anger, these kinds of things. And he essentially was arguing that these two personality traits are universal. Everybody is to one degree or another extroverted. Everybody is to one degree or another emotionally unstable. You might be very, very minimally neurotic. In other words, you might be fairly emotionally stable. You might be very, very minimally extroverted. In other words, introverted. But basically, he was arguing you can categorize everybody in terms of these two traits. And it turns out, actually, he was dead on. When you look at personality theory, modern personality theory, and all the research that is associated with modern personality theory, these two concepts far and away have the firmest empirical support. There is virtually no doubt that he was right, that you can categorize essentially all human beings' personality in terms of degree of extroversion and degree of neuroticism. He thought these two variables, these two traits, important because he saw them as very, very closely connected to physiological functioning. Neuroticism, I think I had the note there on the slide, that neuroticism he saw as coming from somebody whose kind of baseline level of limbic function, limbic system. Remember, the limbic system is kind of the emotional brain, so to speak, the part of the brain from which your emotional experiences arise. And he was hypothesizing that people who are neurotic have a higher baseline level of activity in the limbic system, and their sympathetic nervous system, that aspect of the nervous system that is arousing, he hypothesized in these people is just more reactive. So something happens and they respond more strongly to it just on a physiological basis. And then with extroversion, he hypothesized that the person essentially, the extrovert essentially needed more stimulation from their environment in order to feel okay. And the converse of that would be the person who is introverted is easily overstimulated by their environment cognitively, and so enjoys a lower level of stimulation, and may prefer more time by themselves, more quiet time, that sort of thing. But the important thing with extroversion and neuroticism is the reason he pushed them was the idea that fundamentally you can trace both of these personality traits back to physiological underpinnings. You are extroverted and neurotic to one degree or another, depending on how your physiology functions. I'm going to give you this graphic depiction of these two traits, neuroticism and extroversion, plotted against one another, and basically to give you a picture of how it begins to describe personality. You can see in each of the quadrants there how you might describe somebody who, say, is high in neuroticism and high in extroversion: touchy, restless, aggressive, excitable, changeable, impulsive, etc., etc. As opposed to somebody who is low in each. So they're low in extroversion and low in neuroticism, passive, thoughtful, controlled, even-tempered, these kinds of things. A couple of interesting things. One, very accurate and applicable. Good job. This theory does a good job of kind of laying out some basic personality types. But the reason I have this chart up here for you is the words there in the middle, in the smaller circle in the middle of it: melancholic, choleric, sanguine, and phlegmatic. Those are words that actually originated out of a theory in ancient Greece. And the theory that they originated out of, an ancient Greek theory, was what we call a type theory. And type, you have basically in personality theory, you have trait theories and type theories. Trait theories are, for Ising's theory, is a trait theory. The idea being that a personality trait you can be high in a personality trait like neuroticism or extroversion, or low in neuroticism or extroversion. There's a continuum there, a matter of degrees, as opposed to a type theory, which hypothesizes that you are either this or that, right? You're not. It's not a matter of degree. It's a matter of type. So it's polar rather than continuous. And one of the first examples of that, and one of the most famous examples of that, was the ancient Greek conceptualization of the four temperaments, and then a guy named Carl Jung, who we're going to talk about in a second. But let's talk about the Greeks first. They proposed this idea that you could explain personality physiologically. So in that sense, they're the precursors to Ising. And because they were arguing that personality is fundamentally a function of physiology. Now, the actual details of their reasoning are not as solid. Hippocrates and a couple of other people developed this theory that our personalities, so our moods, emotions, and the associated behaviors, patterns of behavior, are caused by an excess or an inadequacy of certain bodily fluids, what they call blood, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm. And essentially what they identified was if you are high or low in these things, you demonstrated more or less of certain of four temperaments, four types of personality: the sanguine, the choleric, the melancholic, and the phlegmatic. Now, one of the things you'll notice is these are fairly common personality types. You probably know people who are respectively sanguine, choleric, melancholic, and phlegmatic. Now, the theory that this is due to various fluids or humors in the body being in an excess or having inadequate amounts of blood, phlegm, yellow bile, or black bile, obviously is not valid. But the really interesting thing is, if you go back, I'm not gonna reverse the slides here because it'll mess up the lecture, the embedded lecture. But if you go back a couple of slides and you look at that graphic depiction of Eysenk's theory of extroversion and neuroticism, and you look at it laid out graphically, and you look at the personality types that he ends up describing, and keep in mind, he did this with a fairly reliable, fairly valid scientific, physiological theory underlying. The interesting thing is, he ends up identifying essentially these four temperaments. The four temperaments correspond perfectly. The four temperaments from ancient Greece, based on this theory of humors, correspond almost perfectly with a modern, kind of the first of the really truly modern theories of the physiological basis of personality. So I wanted you to be aware of that connection. I wanted you to obviously to have heard of the four temperaments or the four humors in ancient Greek theory, and I wanted you to know about Eysenck, simply because Eysenck, his thinking forms the basis of what actually is the most popularly accepted modern theory of personality, which we're going to talk about in just a second, which is five-factor theory. But before we talk about five-factor theory, I want to just talk real briefly about Jung, because he is such an interesting and more recently here, very influential guy. He was a student of Freud's. Freud initially adored Jung and saw him as the person who could potentially take over the movement of psychoanalysis and promote it after Freud retired or died, only to eventually have a complete break between the two of them as Jung pursued more and more and more ideas of his own about the personality that were incorporating some ideas that Freud was uncomfortable with, and Freud also resented the fact that Jung rejected some of his theories about how the personality develops. Most people tend to respond more positively to Jung than to Freud. Jung is essentially much more accessible, much less deterministic, much less pessimistic than Freud. He's more open to the inexplicable, to the metaphysical, to spiritual ideas, these kinds of things. So generally people, and frankly, I think he's arguably perhaps a little more enjoyable to read. Freud was a great writer, but he wrote very, very methodically, and his writing is very dense. Jung's writing can be very dense, and it can be very difficult to read, especially if you want to really get everything out of it, but it can also be a bit more accessible to the casual, non-technical reader. So anyway, fairly popular guy, fairly popular thinker. The few things, there's a lot of things that are interesting, fascinating about Jung. He contributed a lot to modern psychology, even if he has been somewhat rejected today. He's basically what's happened with him, as has happened with Freud, is that psychology and the modern world accepted the preponderance of what they recommended or what they hypothesized, what their theories hypothesized. The modern world has accepted the vast preponderance of it, and has accepted it so completely that we don't identify it anymore with Freud or Jung. And the only way we think about Freud or Jung are in the context of the things that are either unpopular today or have been disproven. But the reality is, for both Freud and Jung, they had a profound influence on modern psychology and a profound influence on the modern world in general. But I could talk way too long about Freud and Jung. I'm going to confine myself real briefly to talk about Jung. I want to make sure I mention the fact that he emphasized a process of what he called individuation, which sounds like it would be referring to separating from those around you, but in fact was not about that. It was him emphasizing that as a person develops along healthy dimensions, he or she becomes individuated in the sense of becoming more and more and more integrated and more whole. Remember how we were talking about Freud proposing that much of who you are falls below the level of awareness. Jung would definitely agree with that. He would agree with Freud that the preponderance of the person is unconscious. But he believed that as you mature and as you became more fully developed as a human being, as you moved toward what Maslow characterized as actualization, you become better and better integrated, which to him meant you pulled into your awareness more and more and more of who you are. Essentially, you were hiding less of who you are from yourself and accepting more and more completely everything positive and negative that you are. And he believed that this greater and greater individuation essentially becomes expressed in a certain kind of wisdom, capacity for self-acceptance, obviously, acceptance of others, just general maturation and balance in the personality. Now, I mentioned to you that when I was talking about PSYC that I was going a little bit out of chronological order, and the reason I was saying that to you is that PSYC's ideas about extroversion were anticipated by Jung. Jung was talking in terms of extroversion before PSYC was, and frankly, PSYC's theory, ideas about extroversion probably were based, at least in part, on Jung's description of what he called attitudes of focus, and he essentially broke down the way a person's mind works in terms of the influence on their personality, as either being primarily externally focused, extroverted, which by the way is misspelled there on your slide. It's extra with an A version, and introversion. So somebody who is extroverted, he argued, is externally focused, energetically and attention-wise. And somebody who is introverted is essentially their energy and attention is directed inward. And PSYC took this basic idea of extroversion and began to reflect on the possible physiological underpinnings and this concept, extroversion, to one degree or another, you can be more or less extroverted, that Jung started and PSYC ran with. Today actually is one of the most well-researched, solidly based ideas about describing personality. Another thing that I want to make sure I mention to you about Jung is the idea that he proposed for something that he called the persona. And the persona is essentially, he argued, the act that we put on consciously. It's the mask that we adopt so that we can function well in society and be accepted. And this is, I think, a useful concept. He wasn't saying that this was a bad thing, but he was cautioning against becoming too closely identified with one's persona, to make sure that we recognize that this is not actually who we are, that we are more than just our personas. That the persona is your public self, but that hopefully, if you're a healthy person, there's more to you than this, and it's an important thing not to let that become the entirety of who you are. He also proposed a really interesting idea that is worth looking at if you find any of this stuff interesting. The idea of the collective unconscious, which he defined as a psychic system of a collective, universal, and impersonal nature, which is identical in all individuals. And basically what he's talking about here is he's making the argument that Freud's unconscious essentially rests upon, metaphorically, rests upon a more fundamental shared humanness. And basically what he means by this is that by virtue of being human, by virtue of thousands of generations of human experience over millions of years of human existence and our ancestors' existence, that we have genetically encoded in the way our brains function, the way our brains are organized, the potential for certain ideas, certain ways of thinking about the world. And it's almost as if he's saying that we all share this common sort of genetic physiological preparation for how we are likely to interpret the world, right? And essentially this is, you can kind of think about it like this. We certainly have a collective ear, eye, elbow, in the sense that the basic structure and function of the eye, the elbow, the ear, is common to all human beings in whom those things are not defective. We each have our own unique eye, ear, elbow, etc. But your elbow, her elbow, his elbow, my elbow are all identifiable. You can look at it and you recognize, although they're each unique, we can look at an elbow or an ear or an eye and recognize, yep, that's an elbow. Universally, that's an elbow. Universally, that's an eye. That's an ear. And essentially what he was saying is that just as you have that with basic parts of our body, you also have this in terms of the way our brains function, that there are certain things that are kind of universal to the way that our brains interpret the world, think about the world, think about ourselves, that's so on and so forth. Now, he went even further than that and hypothesized that this may actually explain some really interesting phenomenon like what he called synchronicity. I would like to talk about this at length, but I just realized I'm already going well beyond what I anticipated for this lecture. I will leave it at this. If you have the opportunity, go look up online the Jungian idea of synchronicity and how it's connected to the unconscious. It's fascinating, cutting edge stuff, a little strange, a little new age stuff, but very interesting. I'd like to say a lot more about the collective unconscious and about a related concept. And if we were actually in class, I probably would talk to you more about this. This concept of archetypes. It's a fascinating idea related to the idea of the collective unconscious, but they're just, I will go on for another half an hour if I even begin talking about that, and I know you don't want that. So I'm going to jump to just very, very briefly speak to the basic structure of Jung's theory of personality, which is premised on the two attitudes we were talking about, introversion and extroversion. Either an external focus of energy and emotion and cognition, or an internal focus of energy, emotion, and cognition. So he said basically that's the fundamental attitude of your attention, external or internal, extroverted or introverted. And then he observed that there are, on top of that, or under that, I guess, I don't know, corresponding to those attitudes, that we have two pairs of cognitive functions, that we have 4 total cognitive functions. And he broke these down in terms of rational and irrational cognitive functions. So what he was basically saying is that you have a pair of cognitive functions that are essentially built around rational processes of making judgments about the world, making decisions about the world. And he says that he was arguing that you make decisions about the world fundamentally, either by thinking about them or by feeling about them, right? Your judgments about the world are fundamentally feeling or thinking based. And that in addition to that cognitive function of making judgments about the world, we also have the cognitive function of simply perceiving the world. And those perceiving functions he characterized as fundamentally irrational. They're not logic-based. They're not ration. They're not thinking-based. Maybe is a better way of saying it. And he proposed these as sensation, which is exactly what you would think, perceiving the world in a very kind of concrete, pragmatic way on the basis of sensation experience with the senses. Or intuition, which is kind of more of an instinctual, gut level way of experiencing the world around you. And the reason I want to bring these up is because they form the basis of a fairly popular, if somewhat controversial, personality measure that's used fairly commonly today, especially in school settings and in employment settings, that we call the Myers-Briggs Type Inventory. And essentially what the Myers-Briggs Type Inventory is doing is it categorizes personality according to, are you introverted or extroverted? Are you predominantly judging or perceiving? So which pair of cognitive functions do you tend to place primacy? Do you tend to use most heavily? And then, are you more of a thinker or a feeler? Are you more of a sensor or an intuitor? So basically you have 4 dimensions to your personality: introversion, extroversion, judging, perceiving, thinking, feeling, sensing, intuiting. And what it results in are 16 basic personality types. Now, like I said, this is a controversial personality measure. There's considerable debate about it, and most of the debate is, or most frequently what you hear among professionals is this doesn't have a lot of validity, and the reliability is very questionable. That being said, people tend to respond very well to this. It does tend to be a fairly useful measure in terms of being fairly easy to administer, and it's fairly productive in terms of you give it to a work group, say in an employment setting, and it's a good jumping off point for talking about how does somebody who is an extroverted thinker interact with somebody who is an introverted feeler. I'm oversimplifying, but you get the idea. And the other thing is that most of the time when you give somebody a Myers-Briggs type inventory and they get their results, they look at their results, and other people who know them look at their results and go, yep, that actually fits you pretty well. So that leads somewhat to the test popularity. I want to just make mention of this because you will at some point run into the Myers-Briggs, and I wanted you to kind of know where the theory comes from. Okay, so the last of the theories that I want to make sure I present to you, I'm going to do this very quickly. I'm going to try to keep this less than 2 hours. Is what we call the 5-factor theory. And the 5-factor theory, we've got to talk about it because it is the most popular current theory of personality. It has the strongest empirical basis. It's been very, very well researched. And essentially what it is that it's making the argument that every human being walking the face of the planet can be described in terms of 5 traits, 5 dimensions: openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. And you can see in that order why they comprise the acronym OCEAN: openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. And basically what the theory is proposing is that every human being alive can be categorized in terms of how open are you, how conscientious are you, how extroverted are you, how agreeable are you, and how neurotic are you. And yes, you will notice there that extroversion and neuroticism were things that originated, well, I won't say originated, but were developed earlier by Eysenck, and are essentially 100% consistent with his ideas. The one other thing I want to make sure I mention to you is while this is broadly accepted and there's very good research for it, it isn't without some debate. There is some debate about whether there are additional dimensions that are necessary in order to best describe personality, and I would argue that's a very good debate to have. There are important aspects of personality that are not covered by these 5 factors, that can't be explained by these 5 factors. Basic things like to what degree is a person humorous or not? To what degree do they use humor? Because that's such an important interpersonal trait. Heck, even things like religiosity. Or here's one. Who would argue that degree of attractiveness, and I'm not talking about physical appearance, I'm talking about the overall attractiveness of a personality. Of course, that's a vital aspect of personality, and it's hinted at by this, particularly when you look at extroversion and agreeableness, but it perhaps under-explains that. Regardless, I want to make sure you're aware that while this is a broadly accepted theory and there is very good data supporting it, one of the strongest data-supported theories in the field of psychology, there is still some debate about it, and there should be. Well, all we're going to do here is I want to make sure you're aware of just generally what the 5 factors are. Beyond that, I'm not going to ask you to know a lot about this. So, on each of these 5 dimensions, these are traits as opposed to types. So type, remember, a type is either or. Traits are, there's a continuum. You can be more or less. So the first of the traits that we'll talk about is what we would call openness. And openness is essentially making reference to cognition. And it's basically how open are you to new ideas, to novel experience. People who are high in openness tend to be fairly creative, imaginative, and cognitively flexible people. They tend to be open to new ideas. They tend to be on a political continuum. They tend more liberal, as opposed to somebody who is low in openness or is more conventional, who would tend more toward conservatism. In fact, if you give somebody a personality measure, a 5-factor personality measure, and you get a measure of their degree of openness, you can predict with a very high degree of reliability their political stance. And you can also predict very well, and this is consistent with personality stances in general, the degree to which they prefer variety as opposed to routine. You know, somebody who is low in openness is going to be very routine bound, going to tend to be very routine bound. Somebody who's very high in openness is going to prefer a lot of variety. The second of the 5 factors of the ocean theory would be conscientiousness. And this is basically the degree to which a person is dependable, organized, feels a sense of obligation to those around them. And it's basically making reference to the degree of effort that the person puts in to managing, to use the Freudian language, managing id impulses, managing urges that could complicate their capacity to interact peacefully and smoothly and effectively with others. People who are high in conscientiousness do tend to be a little more achievement focused, but they do tend to be less spontaneous. Again, not surprising. They're more organized. They're more disciplined. We've already talked a good bit about extroversion and introversion, referring basically to the degree to which you are focused externally or internally. People who are extroverted in the terms of five-factor personality theory tend to be happier. They tend to be more connected with people around them, which is probably one of the reasons why they're happier. They tend to ruminate less, also one of the reasons why they probably are happier. Tend to be seen as more enthusiastic, action oriented, meaning that they're more active in their world, more talkative, more assertive, that sort of thing. The fourth of the five factors is what we would call agreeableness. And this is basically how much effort do you put into getting along with others? How do you think about other people? Do you fundamentally have a positive attitude towards other people or a negative attitude toward people? Are you fundamentally kind and generous and trusting and trustworthy, or not? This dynamic is essentially kind of, I guess you could say it's indicative of the degree of investment in interpersonal relationships. How valuable are interpersonal relationships to you? And just to make a quick distinction, because I know I kind of spoke in those terms a bit in those terms about conscientiousness. Conscientiousness is kind of the duty-driven arm of this. Agreeableness is the peace-driven arm. You know, how hard are you willing to work to get along with others? So somebody who's very, very conscientious may be devoted to the group in the sense of being reliable and duty-bound and responsible, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're willing to get along with everybody else. If somebody who's very high in conscientiousness might in fact be very difficult to get along with, especially by people who are not as rule-focused as them, who are less responsible, who are perhaps more hostile. If they're experienced as violating rules, somebody who's very high in conscientiousness may actually get into fairly significant conflict with them, simply because it's not so much that they're willing to give up everything to get along. They're kind of giving a place of primacy to responsibility, rules, etc. Whereas somebody who's high, so that's somebody who's high in conscientiousness. Somebody who's high in agreeableness, on the other hand, will go along to get along, right? You know, so they're less likely to cause waves. And then the last thing, again, also one of the dimensions that was proposed by PSYC is neuroticism, or emotional instability. To what degree is a person emotionally overreactive, highly vulnerable to stress, tend to have negative emotional states on a regular basis, that sort of thing. There is much, much more that I could say about five-factor theory. I would very strongly recommend to you, if you're at all interested in personality theory, to go online onto YouTube and type in Jordan Peterson five-factor theory, and you'll get a handful of lectures ranging from about 15 minutes up to an hour, where he lays out kind of how he's a five-factor personality theory specialist, and he does a very good job laying out kind of how these variables interact, how they predict things like, and how do they explain things like, say, the wage gap, how they got selected for over the course of evolution, these kinds of things. So fascinating lectures. I'm going to cut myself short here. I'm not going to say anything more about it. I gave you the basic things that I want you to be aware of for the exam. This is it for the lectures. So I'm not going to say any more other than wish you good luck on the exam. I'll send you an email to confirm that this is posted. and I'll send you an email a couple of days before I actually post the exam, just to make sure you're aware of it and what the expectations are. All right. Well, good luck with the rest of your semester, and I hope everything is going well at your end.